CBF family, would you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, gather us up now from so many different places, looking through so many different screens, feeling scattered in body. Unite us now around your word. Take the ordinary words of this preacher and plant seeds in our hearts so that we might be different because of this gathering, this time together for your glory. Lead us, gracious God. We ask it in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. So, every once in a while, a preacher finds herself on ground that seems a bit more holy than usual. And today is one of those days. I'm deeply honored to be preaching at the closing worship of this year's annual gathering because I know a bit of the sacrifice and the holy grit that church leaders have shown this year. And I know a bit of what we have all walked through to get here. So I am not just a divinity school professor. I'm a pastor's wife, which means that this year I have had a front row seat for all that my husband has gone through to love his people and preach the word. He has had to learn how to proclaim the gospel over YouTube and Facebook Live and Zoom, all three. He preached Easter in our backyard. He oversaw an online VBS. He video edited a pre-recorded nativity play. And he buried saints, grieving their deaths without being able to hug their families. He kept shut-ins connected with phone calls, sometimes talking them through a summary of his Sunday sermon because they didn't have access to internet. He mailed out more care cards than I can count. He worried over the budget, yes. But he worried more about how to be faithful to God's call when Ahmaud Arbery was killed. And then Breonna Taylor was killed. And then George Floyd was killed. He worried about how to witness, to love in a divisive election season. He worried when his parents got COVID and he had to buy their groceries from 4 states away. He said gracious goodbyes when longtime members left our purple congregation for congregations that were more red or more blue. He was lonely. And he learned more than he ever wanted to know about viruses. He tracked COVID positive test percentages and attended pandemic safety seminars, and he was up at 6 a.m. praying, and some nights he'd toss and turn long after he should have been sleeping. And I say all this to you, not because he's special, but because he's a pastor. And many of you within the sound of my voice today are also pastors. And if you're not pastors, you're leaders, which means you've been carrying this burden too. You know what it means to love and grieve and worry about God's people, and you know what it means to get weary. So this is holy ground, because our God sustains the weary with a word. Our God also has a sense of humor, which I discovered about 3 months ago when Andy Young sent me the theme verse of our annual gathering, 2 Corinthians 8:9. Notice not 2 Corinthians 9:8, which is our actual more than enough theme verse. You can check the email, 2 Corinthians 8:9, which reads, "For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich." It seemed an odd verse choice for a COVID year, but then I read verses 10 and 11. And in this matter, I'm giving my advice. It's appropriate for you who began last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something, to finish doing it, so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. So I'm reading that passage on my couch last December, and I'm thinking, man, that's gutsy. The CBF is bold, because you know what Paul's talking about in that passage. It's Paul's fundraising letter for the poor in Jerusalem. And it's not a weak-kneed request. For 2 full chapters in both 2 Corinthians 8 and 2 Corinthians 9, Paul is pressing the Corinthian church to follow through on their financial commitments, which is really a faith commitment to those that are suffering. Don't go backwards, he says. Finish what you started. Don't just do enough. Desire more. North Carolina does not play, I thought. But as I sat with that text, I realized I was hungry for it. I wanted what Paul was offering. I wanted more than the weariness of this past year. I wanted a renewal of commitment. I wanted a renewal of connection. I wanted a renewal of justice, a renewal in mission, a renewal of my understanding of how the everyday nuts and bolts of church administration are connected to the big story of God, because you can lose track of that over Zoom. I wanted more than interruption. I wanted more than half measures and self-justification and self-preservation. I wanted a renewal of holy desire. Because there's nothing more beautiful than when the desire of God wakes up the desire of God's people. So, when Andy told me the next day, still back in December, that I had the wrong verse, that the citation had been inverted, I decided to stick with the inverted version. In part because 2 Corinthians 8:9 is materially connected in content and theology to that promise of more than enough in 2 Corinthians 9:8. But also because 2 Corinthians 8:9 had stirred something in me. It reminded me of a story that was bigger than COVID and bigger than the election and bigger than the insurrection or the impeachment that followed the insurrection. It was a story of a different kind of inversion, a divine kind of inversion, a Philippians 2 kind of inversion, where a God that stands over all the earth empties God's self in the person of Jesus Christ, dying and rising and ascending for the sake of real relationship with God's body, bearing our burdens and taking on our suffering and sin so we could participate with that God, so that we could live into our calling as image bearers and covenant keepers and witnesses to a different way. But there's something odd about that 2 Corinthians 8:9 passage. I mean, did you catch it? It recasts that whole beautiful Christological narrative into the metaphor of money, which is gutsy and also kind of dangerous, because Paul is no prosperity gospel preacher. He knows that Jesus' followers aren't destined for wealth, at least not by worldly standards. Paul knows that discipleship is about sacrifice and service. So what is he doing transposing this sublime theology into these messy, monetary categories of rich and poor? I think there's two reasons, at least. And here's the first. Paul uses that money metaphor because he wants the Corinthian church to know they are richer than they think they are. This is a church that is deeply divided. That there were competing versions of the gospel tearing at its common life. There were Christian leaders who were actively undermining Paul's authority. And yes, they had felt the winds of persecution and exclusion and changes in status. This was a church that was weary. And in their weariness, all they could see was scarcity. They had stopped seeing the treasures that God had put in their hands. They had stopped seeing the kindness of God. The church that my husband served when we lived in New Jersey was not a rich church. When we arrived there, there were 15 people in the pews representing 9 native languages. The front doors of the church were broken, and when you walked in the back door, there was a tarp that was pinned to the ceiling to catch the dripping water from the leaky roof. There was no children's Sunday school. There was no adult fellowship program. There was an AA meeting that met in the basement 5 days a week. It was the largest AA meeting in the city. It was about 100 people strong. But many in that group were living on the street, or they were early in recovery with more needs than 15 people with 9 native languages among them knew what to do with. We were not rich. And I had 2 elementary age school children. And so God and I had it out on occasion. How was I supposed to teach my children what church is meant to be like in a place like this? I mean, we barely had the resources to keep the heater fixed, much less reach out to others. But God has a sense of humor and a holy desire for inverting expectations. One Sunday, 3 years into my husband's ministry, I walked into that sanctuary, and all of a sudden, I saw it. The riches of God. A man who'd been living on the street was laughing, comfortably, clear-eyed, curious, with one of our church leaders. In the back, there was a pew that was filled with neighborhood children. Their parents still weren't coming, but we visited their homes regularly. And the bulletin in my hand listed 3 adult baptisms that were going to happen that day. Now, y'all, my husband is a Methodist pastor. Adult baptisms don't happen every day in the Methodist church. This is an act of God, right? And there were my children skipping up and down the aisles, so happy to be twirling around on this stained red sanctuary carpet. And I felt for all the world like I'd just grabbed the brass ring, like I'd won the lottery. Everybody talking about the church dying, and I was watching a church come back to life. That church, that AA group, that eroding corner, there were riches in that community that God was trying to get me to see, and I almost missed it. I had become so convinced of our poverty that I didn't see the crowns on our heads. Now, New Jersey is not the only place that God's people have crowns. There are crowns in little churches all over North Carolina. There are riches in your congregations. Or maybe it's the elderly saint who donated her best china when your church outfitted the home for a refugee family because I'd like for them to have something pretty, she said. Or maybe it's the husband who showers his ailing wife and then combs her hair and figures out the mysteries of the internet just so she can get to worship. Or maybe it's the deacon member that stood with you in that difficult meeting about whether to worship online or in person. Or that teenager that doggedly lifts up those detained at the border at every single Sunday morning prayer time, even when those around her are shifting uncomfortably in their seats, wondering just how long we're going to keep praying about this. I know this has not been an easy year. And for every sweet story that I tell up here, I know you've got another story that's hard to swallow. The Corinthian church did too. But Paul would not let them forget God's goodness, not when there was so much on the line. And make no mistake, there is a great deal on the line right now, too. There are pastors who have one foot out the door because they look at their divided, struggling churches and they think, surely there's somebody who could do this better. There are young people that are wondering what the church has to say to real-world suffering and cynicism, to real-world charlatans who have exchanged the gospel of Jesus for a thinly veiled nationalism. There are church leaders who have been putting in the time and the prayer and the goodwill to hold together a church that every other force in this country seems set on dividing. Weary leaders who are wondering if it is all worth it. I came across an article this last week about 6 bright-eyed seminarians 10 years after graduation. Only one of them was still working in the church. And frankly, he sounded like he wasn't sure how much longer he was going to last. It was the saddest thing I have read in a long time. And not because I think the churches are the only place where ministry happens. God's Spirit blows far and wide, works in all kinds of vocations and workplaces. God's Spirit moves in factories and kitchens and even some boardrooms. But something was off in that article. Something was missing. It was like nobody had told these young leaders, these leaders with all of this promise and all of this training, no one had told them that the church matters. Not just in the abstract, but in the concrete. That the ordinary nuts and bolts, dirt under your fingernails work of building a community grounded in gospel is work that is worth your life. And that's the second reason why I think Paul uses that money metaphor, because he's telling the church in Corinth that God's big story, God's saving revelation of God's love is connected to the ordinary matters of congregational living. Those budget meetings and those denominational reports and those committee minutes and those stewardship campaigns and the moments for mission and the Sunday school craft bins and the Thanksgiving food drives, they matter. God uses those everyday decisions of how God's people spend their time and how they spend their finances and how they love their neighbors as signs of God's inversion in Jesus Christ. Church administration matters to God. You didn't think that was going to be my good news today, did you? But it is. And it does. The work of the church matters to God, and it matters to the world. That's good news for a gathering of church leaders. But it's also a calling to account. Because if the big story of what we believe is connected to the everyday realities of the church, then we have some soul searching to do. This gospel is not just pretty talk. It has implications for our life together. And those implications play out on the ground. They play out in how we treat our staffs and how we protect our elderly. They play out in how we respond to a pandemic which has not been experienced equally across our communities. Most folks at the church that I now attend have struggled with loneliness and anxiety throughout this year, but they have not struggled to get enough to eat. They might know one or two persons who have gotten sick from COVID, and some even know somebody who died. But I have an African American colleague at the Divinity School who has lost 12 people in her immediate circle of relationships. 12. Lasmia, who advocates for immigrant families in Durham, spent the summer putting together food packets for undocumented families in our area. And every 2 weeks, 200 cars would snake through our parking lot because 200 families had bare cupboards. God's children are suffering under very different burdens from the same pandemic, which means that very different levels of stepping up and sharing are required. Jesus' church is about more than enough for ourselves, because Jesus desires more than enough for the world. 2 Corinthians 8:5 gives away a secret about the holy desire that transforms a church. It doesn't just come from us. It flows from the heart of God. It's God's desire, or will, as it's often translated, that shifts our vision and our priorities. And so I ask you, what desire of God did you glimpse last year, or even begin to glimpse? Was it a desire for the church to live as if our lives depended on each other? To live the truth that Paul knew, that if Christians in Corinth are unworried about Christians in Jerusalem, then it won't be long before there was no church in Corinth. Was it a desire for the church not to take that connection, this connection, for granted? To live as if this beautiful, broken church was bought with a price, not something to be taken lightly or traded for some tinny version of ideological purity, but something to fight for, or harder than that, something to repent for and change for and try again for. Was it a desire to see the church complete the good work that God had placed in her hands? Or more to the point, to allow God to complete the work that God has started in us? So much has been interrupted by this past year. But not that. God has not given up on our completion or on this world's completion. God has not given up on the more than enough that we were called to be. So don't you. Christmas was different at our church last year. There was no poinsettia tree. There was no gingerbread breakfast. There was no Christmas cantata. But one day my husband came home from work shaking his head and laughing. He'd been talking to the leader of La Semilla and a local campus ministry about doing a living nativity in our parking lot. The campus ministry had Joseph and Mary costumes, and because the ministers were married, they could take their masks off in the stable. La Semilla had COVID educational information in Spanish to pass out to families who drove by in their cars, along with some candy bags. But we need animals, my husband said, looking at me closely, the way that pastors sometimes look at their spouses before making a request. You think you could make some of those, animal headband things? So I've been making these construction paper headbands with ears for every children's Christmas pageant I've ever led, and I've led a few. But there wasn't going to be a Christmas pageant this year. So this was kind of my cue. And a few hours later, we had cow headbands, and we had sheep headbands, and I had a donkey headband. They were more crooked than usual, and they were patched together with Scotch tape, but that felt appropriate for the year we'd had. I was not expecting much. The night of the Living Nativity, we were lined up around the parking lot wearing our construction paper animal ears, when one of our college students showed up with an inflatable Tyrannosaurus Rex costume. "I heard you needed animals," she said. Again, God has a sense of humor, and we were kind of past propriety. There was something more that God was after that night in us. Blossomy had brought a loudspeaker with a playlist of mariachi Christmas music and carols sung in Spanish, and the campus ministers had brought their new baby. And of course, it started to rain. Standing in the dark on that slick concrete, a construction paper crown, damp on my forehead, making sure the Tyrannosaurus Rex didn't trip as he passed out safety masks to children as they drove by the Bethlehem stable, something began to stir in me. Something that had been a long time coming and that I had forgotten to hope for. I'd even forgotten to ask for. Maybe it was that overplayed version of Feliz Navidad. I want to wish you a Merry Christmas. But I did. I wanted so badly to wish the world a Merry Christmas. I wanted so badly for Christ's church to witness together, not just on holidays, but every day. I wanted so bad for this story of the Prince of Peace who became a pauper to change our nation and to change our community and to change our world. And I wanted so bad, I started dancing. And soon the whole parking lot was dancing. And even the Tyrannosaurus was dancing. And I was crying because there is nothing more beautiful than when the desire of God wakes up the desire of God's people. And that's my question to you, CBF. What desire is God waking in you? And what difference will that desire make when you leave this gathering? You, who last year not only began to do something, but even desired to do it. Strengthen your feeble arms and your weak knees. Complete the costly work of connection that God has begun according to your means. Live out that connection with generosity in your line items and policies that strive for fair balance so that those who have much will not have too much and those that have little will not have too little. Fight for your neighbor as if your life depended on it, because it does. Don't go backwards. Desire more. For you are held together by the one that desires you. The one who can still turn this world upside down. And that one is more than enough.